So this involves a story where Jesus, of course, is up in heaven, and he gets to wondering, where is my earthly father? I haven't seen him. I certainly hope he made it to heaven, made it to paradise. And he no sooner has this thought than he sees this elderly man sitting on a bench, and the man is crying. And Jesus goes up to the man and he says, what's wrong? And the man says, oh, I'm looking for my son. And so Jesus sits down and he says, well, was this really your biological son? And he said, well, no. Not really, but he always wanted to be like the other boys. And he said, well, was your son, was he kind of non-human? And the old man says, well, he looked human enough, but he wasn't really. So Jesus is getting excited now, and he says, well, were you by any chance a carpenter? And the old man goes, well, yes, I was. And he said, well, was your name by any chance Joseph? And the old man says, well, translated, yes, it was Joseph. So Jesus throws his arm around the man and says, Joseph, father. And the man goes, Pinocchio. I did it. So that's my joke. Not really my joke, I borrowed it, but that story, that's a search story, which adoptees, as you know, many adoptees do choose to search. I'm going to say a little bit more about myself. I was an attorney for 10 years, and then I became a psychotherapist, and I do counsel adoptees and birth parents and rarely adoptive parents in my practice. So I just want to acknowledge with my psychotherapist hat on that this is a very emotional topic, certainly for myself, but about 60% of people in America have a family member who is involved in what's called the adoption triad, meaning an adoptee, a birth parent, or an adoptive parent. And I'm sure some of this is reflected in this group here today. Some of you may be, and some of what I say may be very emotional for you. So this isn't about emotion. It's not about the emotions of searching, but I want to just acknowledge that this is something that affects many of our lives, and that it may be emotional for you today. But the approach that I'm talking about today has to do with the matter of the civil and human right of adoptees to know where they came from, to know their biological origins. And unfortunately, we live in an era, fortunately at the end of an era, of what's a failed social experiment in secrecy. Before the beginning of the 1900s, the system that we most think of now, which is basically what's called closed adoption, where adoptees don't know the identity of their birth families, and adoptive parents and birth parents didn't know each other. That was about a 50-year experiment, maybe from 1920s, 30s, 40s, up to the end of the 19th century. It's really changing now a lot. And Connie, by the way, Connie is the Karen Caffrey equivalent in Texas. She's leading the charge in Texas. But this era, and particularly the era, the post-World War II to about the 70s or so, early 80s, which is called in adoption reform circles the baby scoop era. And what that refers to is that there were about 2.5 to 4 million infants were relinquished by mostly their unwed mothers. This was a time when there was a sort of sexual liberation had happened. There was more sexual activity, but it was before birth control was widely used. It was before Roe versus Wade and abortion. And there was an incredible stigma, as most of you know, I'm looking at the faces here, you grew up in this era. There was an incredible stigma to unwed pregnancy. And there were a lot of social and religious forces in place that if a young woman, it was mostly young women who became pregnant before marriage, they were strongly encouraged, some would say forced or coerced, to release their children and not parent them. That has largely changed today, and actually that's the primary reason there are so few infant adoptions in America today, because the vast majority of young women who get married who are unwed parent their children. They are not sent to unwed mother homes. If you want to learn more about that, there's a woman named Ann Fessler who has written a book called The Girls Who Went Away, and it is a really heartbreaking, heart-wrenching account based on personal interviews of women who relinquished their children during the baby scoop era. So that's a little bit of history. Now, what I'm going to actually do something very basic. What our group is trying to do, and what the political approach is, the tactical approach to end this era as a matter of law in a state-by-state basis, focuses on the right of adult adoptees to have a copy of what's called their original birth certificate. So I actually brought copies of both my birth certificates. And this, by the way, is the law in all 50 states. There's what's called a dual birth certificate system that applies to adoptees. In Connecticut, and I'm sure Texas has a very similar law, whenever a baby is born, a birth certificate by law must be prepared within 10 days of birth. And I actually happen to possess a copy of mine, and you can't read this, and neither can I because my glasses are not on, but if you were to read this, it would tell you a baby girl was born in 1959 to Denise and Don Cummings in Middletown, Connecticut. And this document, this is a copy, was prepared and filed within 7 days, as it happens, of my birth. Because I was subsequently relinquished for adoption, I was placed in an adoptive family. Usually there's some period of time, it's often a year or more, before the adoption is actually finalized. At that point, a second birth certificate, and this is a copy of my actual legal birth certificate, is created. It is deliberately created to appear as if the child was the birth child of the adoptive parents. So this has my new name, which was Karen Diane Ostreicher. It has my parents, my adoptive parents' names, replaced Denise and Don's name. It is backdated, so it looks as if it was created at the time of my birth. The intent, the original intent of this system was actually to protect the adoptee from the stigma of illegitimacy. I mean, that's a phrase like what era are we talking about? But back in the day, and which wasn't that long ago, it was thought that, for example, women who conceived children out of wedlock were morally defective, maybe even mentally ill, and that these traits, these moral traits, were transmitted by blood, and so their children had a stigma of bad blood. And the idea with this birth certificate system was to wipe clean the terrible, immoral, tainted origins of this infant and give them a fresh start in their adoptive family. So this was benevolent thinking at the time. Over time, over the course of the 19th century, that has changed. There's been, at some point, the idea was, wow, maybe we should not be judging these birth mothers as being morally deficient or some way defective. So the thinking then was, what we'll do with them is we'll tell them that they can have a fresh start. We're going to send them to these unwed mothers' homes, and we're going to pretend this never happened, and off they can go, and they'll never think about their babies again. They'll just forget about it. And if you hear that today, you think, wow, the psychotherapist in me goes, you're going to forget you had a baby. How many of you forget that women who've had children, forget about your baby? Not too many of you. So that's what the birth certificate system is about. What the legal efforts focus on now in most states, and this is passed in about 12 states, and some states are what are called partial access states, which is what Connecticut is now. Connecticut had, until the mid-1970s, an adult adoptee had the right to get a copy of their original birth certificate. So in my case, that would be the one that named Denise and Don and named me. It had my birth name, the truth about my origins, which meant I could find my ancestry, my updated medical history. I could actually find out where I came from. That was the case in Connecticut until the mid-70s. That was changed in what's called a post-public hearing amendment on an adoption bill that was unrelated. And people in Connecticut have spent, however many years that is, 30 years, 40 years, trying to change it back. And you would think this would be easy. You would think it would be easy. It is not. And I'm sure there's many people here who have been involved in politics and understand the political system, particularly on an issue like this, where there is a history, that is an emotional issue, there is a history of stigma and shame. It is a very, legislators don't want to get near it. I was actually involved in Connecticut in these efforts in the 90s, and we had a hearing before our judicial committee, and we lost. And I will tell you personally, that was devastating. It is devastating to stand up in front of your government and have them tell you, you cannot have this information about yourself. You are not the same as other citizens. And this, to me, is a fundamental human right. I don't believe any person has the right to deprive another of their ancestry, of their blood, of their history. To me, that's wrong. That's immoral. And again, acknowledging completely that many of the intents were originally benevolent. The outcome, in my view, has not been. So I was involved in the 90s. Many people were involved over the years. What happened last year actually, is I got mad again. I hadn't been mad for a while. I thought, I'm pissed. I don't like this anymore. I'm going to do something about this. And actually now, also being in my 50s, I think I was just that much more of an empowered person, that much. I got tired of adoptees coming into my therapy office telling me how they didn't have their rights and how the suffering this caused them. And I said, you know, I'm going to do something about this. So I got very energized and re-involved. The group that I ended up incorporating, the group which is called Access Connecticut now, and we spent the past year fighting like mad and working in the Connecticut legislature to try and get this bill passed. We tried for all adoptees. I will tell you, it is nothing short of a miracle that we got a partial bill. Connecticut has a population of 3.5 million, Texas is 26.5 million, and our legislatures are the same size. We both have about 180, so think about that. We have 180 legislators. We have a part-time legislature that meets every year. I believe yours meets every other year. I don't know how you guys function. Unbelievable. Whatever. Well, but we meet every year, our legislature does, but they have what they call short and long sessions. A short session is a 3-month session and the long is 5 months. This was a short session this year and an election year. Nobody wants to do anything in a short session. Nobody wants to do anything in an election year. We got half a bill, and there was a lot of synchronicity. The problem with this issue is that it's not a party issue. We had supporters on both sides of the aisle. The problem with this issue, there's an incredible amount of myth and misinformation. And I could literally stand here for 2 hours, and I have done this, and I've skimmed just the surface of the kinds of fears and misconceptions and just basic lack of information that the average citizen has about this issue. So it's very labor intensive. I probably met with 40 legislators, a dozen government officials. I mean, the Attorney General, the Commissioner of the Department of Children and Families, the Commissioner of Public Health, the leaders of the Senate, the leaders of the House. You got to sit down with these people, and you have to have time to sit down and talk with these people for an hour. It is about relationships, it is about information, it is about trust. We were very, very fortunate. I said last year, I said to our folks, we need a lobbyist, and we need an ethical lobbyist. Probably some very nice lobbyists here, but we need a lobbyist who really has a lot of integrity, and we were very fortunate to get a gentleman whose sister is an adoptive mother of 5 children. That's how he came to us, and he worked for much less than his usual fee. Matthew Hallisey, Government Affairs, go Matt. Just putting a little plug in there for Matt. Another piece of synchronicity is that there was a freshman legislator who is an adoptee. And his name is David Alexander. He's in our House. He was incredibly committed to this bill. And if you're going to get anything done in the legislature, you need somebody who's going to go and really make it happen when they close the doors and the rest of us little folk are out in the hallway not knowing what's going on. We had, like I said, we had people on both sides of the aisle. What we ended up with is a bill that applies to adoptees who were adopted after 1983. And the little reason that is we had opposition. We had people the big opposition is, what about birth parents who were promised privacy? I will tell you, you will never turn up a legal document, a relinquishment document where that was the case. Most of them are silent, and by the way, it's very, very hard to get a hold of these documents. The few you can get a hold of actually say, birth parent, you will disappear. You will not interfere with the adoptive family. You will you can't go look for that baby when you feel bad in 6 months or a year or 6 years. But our bill restored access partially retroactively, which is the big deal, back to 1983. It goes into effect next summer, and then the bill also says that data will be gathered as a result of it. The bill has also, and this is also the big thing that helps people get over the hump, the concern about birth parents, is that it has something called a contact preference form. So any birth parent who does not wish to be contacted by their adult offspring can file a form with the state that says that. The reality is, in the states that have done this, the vast majority file a form that says, I want to be contacted, here's my address, here's my phone number, please call me, please call me. That's between 95 to 98% of birth parents want to be contacted. So we're talking about a teeny tiny minority, but that's how that concern is addressed. This year, what we'll probably be doing in the legislature is probably be seeking a bill. There's actually a birth parents' right bill. The treatment of mostly women, the women who relinquished children, especially the farther back you go, was horrible. It's misogyny at its worst. And these women, many of these relinquishers were coerced, were forced. These were women who didn't have resources, didn't have money, excuse me. Most of them were not given their relinquishment documents. There's a professor named Elizabeth Samuels at the University of Baltimore, I believe, and she did a nationwide study. She turned up 75 relinquishment documents nationwide. That's all she could get her hands on. And there's millions of adoptees and therefore millions of birth mothers. Our bill this year that we think we're going to go for is a bill that would give birth parents the right to have a copy of whatever they signed to relinquish their child, and actually a right of whatever in their file so they can go back themselves. This is for their healing. It's also, I mean, if you get a car loan, you have a right to that document that you sign. You get a house mortgage, you have a right to get a copy of the mortgage documents you sign. Birth parents, at least in our state, don't have the right to have a document where they relinquish the right to their children. So that's what we're going to try and do. That will help us because what we know is all those documents say nothing about privacy. And if anything, they say, you know, you, birth parent, will disappear and go away and not bother anybody anymore. So that's my 10-minute version. I could talk for 3 hours, but I really want Connie to talk because she knows the history in Texas, which I do not, and she is the leader of the Texas Star Group. And I hope you have lots of questions, and we'll answer them after.